Well, that's actually the thing. There hasn't been any very specific explanation coming out of the Trump administration, whether it's Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, or the White House press secretary, who earlier today had a press conference in which she was asked why specifically the Houston consulate. We understand that you are talking about a wider network of spying and of stealing intellectual property, but why specifically the Houston embassy, the consulate? And to that question, Kelly McEnany simply replied exactly the same words that have been used by Mike Pompeo, talking about this wider network and the fact that Houston is a hub of that spying network, but without giving more details as to what evidence there is. But the overall messaging from the United States and from the Secretary of State is that they are no longer wanting to deal with what China is doing, and that they have been doing that for years, and that now the U.S. is saying stop. Enough. We're no longer going to tolerate that. And the Secretary of State is really increasing the tone over China and really bringing it back to tones from the Cold War, talking about the battle of the free world versus China. Yesterday in his speech, he said, if we bend the knee now, our children's may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party, saying that the primary challenge to the free world was China.
All right, well, Ketavan, in that context, a Chinese researcher who took refuge in the country's San Francisco consulate, that was reportedly to avoid visa fraud charges. That person's been arrested. Do we know anything more about that for the time being?
Well, what we know so far is that Chinese researcher has been taken into custody. She was taken into custody last night. She had been hiding out at that consulate in San Francisco. What is not clear is whether she turned herself in or whether the Chinese consulate, the officials there, agreed to turn her in to U.S. officials. That is still not clear. What is going to happen now is that she is set to appear in court. She has been accused of visa fraud for, according to the FBI, failing to disclose her links to the Chinese military and the Chinese Communist Party. She, during an interview with the FBI last month, denied those links, saying that the only reason she had a picture of her with that military uniform was that she was going to a military medical university for research. So she's denying it, but she's one of 4 Chinese researchers that are now in U.S. custody, accused pretty much of the same thing, of failing to disclose their real identity. And so while there is no direct link, at least according to U.S. officials, with what we've seen with the closure of the consulate in Houston, it goes within that overall reaction of the U.S., which is saying that it is now finally cracking down on what it calls this network of spies, including people, researchers, coming into the United States with the cover of being a researcher to steal some intellectual property or some sensitive information, even from entities and companies that are working on coronavirus research, for example.
All right, Ketavan, as we've got you with us, there is news just coming in about President Trump and the Attorney General, of course, William Barr, announcing the expansion of the so-called Operation Legend, which is apparently sending more federal police forces to Chicago. Can you tell us more?
Yes, this is something that was announced during an announcement by Donald Trump at the White House a couple of days ago, with members of the law enforcement community, as well as family members of children or other individuals that had been killed in the recent spike in violence in several U.S. cities. Now, Operation Legend is something that started in Kansas City. It's basically the U.S. U.S., the federal state, sending in federal agents into a U.S. city or a U.S. state to help local law enforcement to deal with violent crime. What Donald Trump announced is that he's going to extend that to Albuquerque and Chicago, especially Chicago, that has seen a big rise in violent crimes. And those federal agents are supposed officially to go in and help really local law enforcement. There'll be agents from the FBI, for example, or from the Department of Homeland Security that will be working in partnerships with local law enforcement to deal with, for example, violent crime like gun trafficking. And that is something that they're insisting on, which is very different from what we've seen in Portland, which is federal agents really intervening to police the streets of a U.S. city.